Students of class 9. Today I am going to do the chapter Mrs. Willow. Now Mrs. Willow is a character of a very simple woman who lives a very simple life, doing all household duties like digging up potatoes, polishing things and keeping her house clean and bright. But there is some mystery that has surrounded her, and what the mystery was all about only instigates the interest of the poet. So Mrs. Willow became the object of curiosity for the poet, and she became the subject of the poem of this subject of this poem, and written by John Drinkwater. So Mrs. Willow was a very simple woman. This is a story of a very simple woman whose name is Mrs. Willow. Now, first time it is telling Mrs. Thomas Willow seems very glum. Her life perhaps is very lonely and humdrum. So Mrs. Thomas Willow seems to be very glum. Glum means a very sad kind of a gloomy kind of person. And then her life perhaps it was the idea of the poet that her life was very lonely and humdrum, means it's very monotonous and boring. Digging up potatoes, cleaning out the weeds, doing the little for a lone woman's needs. So what does she do? She just digs up potatoes, cleans out the weeds in the garden. Weeds means unwanted plants in the garden, and doing the little for a lone woman's needs. Means whatever she needed very little, and she does or she did the work whatever a lone woman would need. Who was her husband? How long ago? What does she wonder? What does she know? So there was a question that who was her husband? There was a high question that who was her husband? Nobody knew that. And how long ago her husband had left her, or how long ago her husband might have died. Or what does she wonder? It's much time she was saying that she was wondering something, she was thinking something. What does she know? She does not know anything. Why does she listen over the wall? And then another question came in the poet's mind, that it was very interesting to know that she always kept a very sharp ear over the wall to know what was going on outside. So the poet was curious to know which sound made the woman so curious about outside, and what did she want to listen. As though unforgotten was some footfall. So there again another question came, that no one came to visit Mrs. Willow. Mrs. Willow was alone in the house. No one accompanied her, no friends, no relatives, and no near and dear ones, no one was there. So she was completely lonely. So what was the sound she was listening for? And the poet answered himself that she was definitely listening for the sound of the footfall, or she was expecting that someone might come to her house, someone might visit the house, and someone might be taking her news of health or news of well-being. She expected someone to come. So there were many questions which arouses in the mind of the poet, that what was the identity of her husband, whether he had died or what time he had left her, and what she thinks, what was the thought in her mind, and what information she had, or what she knew, whether she knew anything or whether she not knew anything. And morning and noontime and twilight and all. So morning and noontime. So whether in the morning or in the noontime or in the afternoon or in the twilight, means at dawn or at dusk, means whether when the evening was about to set in, that time or that time of twilight, what she was listening over the wall. So what she was trying to know over the wall, as though unforgotten were some footfall, as though she was listening to some footfall. She was expecting to someone to visit them. So she visit her. So she was eagerly waiting for the sound of the footsteps, though it seemed that no one had visited her for a long time. So Mrs. Willow was a lonely woman with a very simple life, and she was doing everything whatever she needed for a lonely life of hers. And she was digging potatoes, she was cleaning the weeds, which means unwanted plants, and she was busy in her household duties. So Mrs. Willow was a very ordinary woman with a very ordinary life. So Mrs. Willow's life was a glum, a sort of gloomy or monotonous or sad type of life. Then humdrum. Her life was full of humdrum. Means it's a very dull or commonplace or ordinary life. Commonplace or ordinary life. Then commonplace or ordinary life. Humdrum. Then her noontime, at noon, means after 12 o'clock, weeds. So weeds means unwanted plants, shrubs or bushes. So unwanted plants, shrubs or bushes. And another thing is that is twilight, at dusk. Here the poet has mentioned the evening time, so at twilight. At twilight. So sound of footfall. What do you mean by sound of footfall? Sound of footfall. It means the sound of footsteps. Okay, so sound of footfall means sound of footsteps. So you have understood that Mrs. Willow's life was a very simple, commonplace life with a tinge of sadness, and she used to involve herself with all domestic duties, and she was eagerly listening for the sound of some footsteps, and she was eagerly expecting someone to come.